Thank you everyone for joining our webinar today. We're going to cover some new tools that have been developed to help you all do local income surveys in order to qualify CDBG projects as area benefit. These are for those situations where the low and moderate income summary data that HUD provides maybe doesn't show that an area is 51% low and moderate income, and you're convinced that that's not the case. There is another way you can confirm that, in fact, 51% of the people living there are low and moderate income people and qualify an area benefit activity. And we're trying to make it easier to do those surveys yourself by providing these tools. Of course, we provide some good old paper templates, as well as Microsoft Forms and a tool in Esri's product, Survey 123, and also a Qualtrics product. So there's a lot of varieties of things that you could, use digital format and send people postcards with QR codes and things like that to do these surveys. So we've really tried to make it easier for you and give you some new tools. So I'll kick it over to Jennifer and get you started.
Thanks, Robert. So thanks again for joining today, and thanks, Robert, for the introduction. My name's Jennifer Stoloff, and I work at Econometrica, and we've been working on this project for a long time, and I'm glad to get a chance to share it with everyone who's joined us today. So first, a few housekeeping notes. If you have questions about the subject matter, about the presentation, please ask that in the Q&A box so it'll be easy for everybody to see. And the HUD team will also be checking in, and they will answer the questions if they have that expertise. And if you're having issues with the audio or any issues with Zoom, please put that in the chat. And I'm joined by Ian Warren, who's the facilitator today from Econometrica, and he'll work with you to resolve any technical issues. Okay, so I'm going to turn my camera off for the majority of the discussion, and I'll move on over to the next slide. So this is our agenda for today. First, we're going to review the learning objectives and then discuss how to plan a survey, including developing the materials, sampling, carrying out the data collection, and analyzing the data. Again, if you have any questions as we go along, please put them in the Q&A, technical issues in the chat. I probably won't be able to answer too many questions as I'm speaking, but somebody will be there to help you. And here are the learning objectives. First, we want to help you decide if it makes sense for your community to undertake an income survey. And the rest of the objectives are about understanding how to plan and successfully field a survey and how to process the data collected. All the materials we will discuss today are available on the HUD Exchange on the CDBG Income Survey Toolkit website. The guidebook includes information on all the topics we'll cover today, but in much more detail. So you can go straight to that site whenever you're ready, and you can review that information. So a little bit of background first. This is the mission statement for the CDBG program. And the purpose of the program is to support community development activities. And we've listed a few examples of eligible activities, and HUD also provides resources to help grantees carry out their program activities. In fact, this webinar is an example of that, as well as the Survey Income Toolkit. Here are some key definitions. So a family can be single or related people, regardless of sexual orientation, gender identity, disability status, age, or marital status. A person is any individual, but a person living alone could be considered a family. And a household would include multiple families. So if there were two people who were roommates, they would be actually two families, but one household. Critical for this presentation, we also define low and moderate income persons. And that's anybody who is a member of a family having an income equal to or less than the Section 8 low income limit established by HUD. Unrelated individuals will be considered as one-person families. and a few more key definitions. There are a few different income definitions that you can use. The definition under the Section 8 HAP program, annual income reported in the most recent decennial census. Sorry, I don't know why it's skipping like that. And the adjusted gross income. So the service area is also really critical for defining who should be included in the survey. So that has to be the geography for the area benefit. And we have our first knowledge check. Ian, you want to throw up the poll? All persons, so the question here is, what is the definition of family? Is it A, all persons related or unrelated occupying a housing unit, or B, a single person or group of related people, which can include children? Okay, so we got a mix of answers here. The answer is B. So the A is actually the definition of a household. So that's all the people who live in the housing unit. That's a household, but some of those people may be unrelated. So B is actually the definition of a family. So that's a separate unit that would live inside the household. And the family is a single person or group of related people, which can include children. Next, we're going to talk about the basic area benefit requirements. And the income survey can be used to provide data that will show that the community is eligible to apply for CDBG funds. Benefits must be available for all residents in the survey area. The area must be primarily residential, and at least 51% of area residents must be LMI, or low and moderate income. And I apologize, I forgot to mention at the top that we are recording this webinar, and it will be available on the HUD Exchange site in the next week or so. And a PDF of the presentation should be available now. So you can download a copy to review later, and it has all of the links that I mentioned in the presentation. So here's some of the reasons to conduct a survey. As Robert mentioned, sometimes the service area doesn't match the HUD provided summary data, the LMISD. In some instances, the area may fit into ACS boundaries, but you have reason to think the ACS data are inaccurate. So here's some examples. If the unit of general local government knows that the income characteristics of the service area may have changed recently, that's a reason you might want to conduct a survey. So let's say there's a new affordable housing development. Or the local government might want to do a survey if the service area boundary doesn't reasonably align with the census boundaries. But they would have to include the entire service area. So if you have 10 block groups and one of them is an upper income block group, it would still need to be included in the service area. Finally, if the LMISD margin of error data does not provide an expanded range for compliance with area benefit LMI criterion. So if a service area of 50% LMI with a 2% margin of error would not qualify as an area benefit activity that using the LMISD, that's an example where even though you only have 50% LMI, not 51%, but you can use that margin of error to decide if you think that data is reasonable or if you want to conduct a survey. So here you've got a margin of error of 2%. That's pretty low, unless you think you could achieve a higher or a lower, in fact, margin of error. You might decide to accept these data. Next, here's another way to think about the income requirements and CDBG eligibility. So in this case, we see that if you're at 100% area median income, then you would not be eligible. But folks who are at 80% of the area median income or 50%, they will all be considered low and moderate income. And this is so basically anybody under 80% of the area median income is in that LMI group. And here's how you would calculate that percentage of the persons that are LMI. So you would take the number of persons in LMI families, and you would divide that by the total number of persons in all families. So here we have the second knowledge check. And these are a little wordy, so I'll read it out to you. So which of the following requirements are true for a service area to qualify for a CDBG funded activity? So you can check all that apply. A, the percentage of LMI persons is at least 51% of the total number of residents in the service area. The service area must be coterminous or match with the city's jurisdictional boundary. C, the percentage of LMI persons can only be determined using the HUD-provided LMISD. And D, a person is considered LMI if their income is equal to or less than 80% of the area median income, the AMI. Or E, the service area must be primarily residential. So a few of these are true, so click all the ones that you think are true. I see a lot of responses rolling in. Okay, looks about everybody's answer who's going to answer. So we'll go ahead and end that poll. All right, so you can see the answers. So here are the answers. I hope this isn't blocking them. So A is true. The percentage of LMI persons is at least 51% of the total number of residents in the service area. So that's correct. B is incorrect. The service area does not need to be coterminous or match with the city's jurisdictional boundary. You can define a service area that crosses a boundary or that is a sub area inside of a larger area. C is also incorrect. You can collect your own data to provide a count of LMI persons. And in fact, that is what the survey we're talking about is designed to do. D and E are also, those are correct. A person is considered LMI if their income is equal to or less than 80% of the AMI. And E, the service area must be primarily residential. Now, I noticed there were some questions in the Q&A about that, so we'll discuss that later. And I know the HUD team is looking at those questions. Next, we'll talk about these different stages of the survey process. These are the steps to planning a survey in detail. And here, the first section is about planning a survey approach. This came up in the last knowledge check about the service area boundaries. So we've touched on the definition already, but it's critical to planning your survey. So before we can create a sampling plan or collect any data, we have to define the service area. And that's the area where you want to conduct your survey. So it can be a neighborhood, it can be a city or a county, it can be a water district, it could be a smaller area inside of a municipality. And there are a variety of data collection methods you can use, and some are distribution modes as well as the data collection method. The most cost-effective approach may be an online or web-based survey that you can, if you had email addresses, it's very efficient to do a web-based survey, but you can also send out a link to take a survey in a letter. And then all the data you collect will be downloaded into a spreadsheet, so the processing time is very minimal. But you may have to pay for the software to do the survey, depending on the size of your community and how many survey responses you're going to need. Paper surveys are also cost effective, but mailing out a paper survey can cost more money because you have to find a way to receive those completed surveys. And then you would also have to do some manual data entry to get that information into a spreadsheet so it can be analyzed. Our Excel tools that are available on the Income Survey Toolkit, they do have a data entry option. And so for a short survey, a paper version is feasible. You can also do telephone and then in-person surveying. So you can give people a number they can call in to take the survey. Calling people to get the survey is pretty challenging. We don't necessarily recommend that, but if you had a list of phone numbers and you had time, you could call people up and ask them to take the survey on the phone. And then you can also, as I mentioned, the in-person would be to go door to door. And if you are going door to door, you can either use something that is web-based by bringing a handheld tablet or even a phone, or you can carry a paper survey with you and do that door to door. So these days, people often will combine more than one data collection mode, and you can save some money, some time, but still reach a representative group. So we did some pilot testing of the survey tools, and we started out with a letter asking people to take the survey online. And then we followed up by going door to door and using a handheld tablet to collect the information. So that is one mixed mode approach. So the next step in the process is to develop your survey materials. So we have a survey, we have examples of the survey. This is a template, so you can modify it. You can change the intro language. You can add information about your community, and you would, of course, have to update the income limit information to the current year and for your local area. And the primary goal of the survey is to collect that community income information. So after you will have drawn a sample, which we'll discuss in a minute, you need to count the permanent residents or the people who live at those addresses most of the time. So all the permanent residents in each family, and then the families in the household. So a household can have more than one family, as I mentioned before. And if you encounter that, then you want to fill out a separate survey for each family. And while asking for the income of the family is the most critical element of the survey, you may decide to collect other information as well. So you could ask for demographic information. You will be asking for family size, but if you wanted other types of information, you could add that to the survey. Selecting the data collection tools, I touched on this a little bit previously. So it really depends on your budget, your sample size, and staff capacity. So we have several example survey instruments available, and we have programmed templates for Qualtrics, Survey 123, which is part of ArcGIS, and Fulcrum, as well as a paper instrument. And we have a version of the paper instrument for going door to door and a version that can be mailed out. And all of these can be modified for your community, and you can just use them as a starting place. So the next poll, this is a poll, not a knowledge check. We are curious about what type of survey method you're most likely to use, or if you have already used one of these, we'd like to know what you have used. So we just give you one option for this poll. So select the one that you plan to use or that you have used. Okay, so this is interesting. So about 26% of folks says they would do web-based, 19% paper, nobody telephone, which I understand. Phone is difficult these days. In-person interviewing, 14%, and mixed mode, 41%. So some combination of the other modes. All right, thank you. So I mentioned all the survey instruments, and this is what it will look like on the website. And you can follow these links to get a copy of all of these different options. And you should always use these in combination with the user guide. So we have a user guide for Qualtrics, Survey 123, and Fulcrum. And before you download anything, please read the user guide. It has a lot of information about how to set up the survey and what information needs to be added and how to add that. Don't just click on the link first. And here are the user guides, the famous user guides. So these user guides will show you how to customize the survey and how to use each application. So for most of the applications, you're going to have to download the local income limits and then upload them into the template or type them in. I believe Microsoft Forms, you have to type it in. And then if you're using the paper survey, you'll want to update that as well. Next, we'll talk about creating a sampling list. The sampling frame is the technical term for the initial list that you will use to create a sample. So that list can be from any local source that you think is reasonably complete. So that could be utility roles, 911 lists, anything else that you have. We know it's not going to be 100%, but you want to choose an option that has all or nearly all of the residential area addresses in the service area. Once you have that list, you're going to need to review it and remove any addresses that are commercial or retail or that are vacant. And it is okay to add or remove addresses on this list based on your personal knowledge of the area. So if you know there's a bunch of vacant addresses or something's been demolished recently and it's still on that list, take it out. That will save you a lot of time in the field. Next, sampling. So there are a few approaches to sampling, but the goal is to draw a representative sample of addresses from the sampling frame. So please see the guidebook for a discussion of how to generate a random numbers, which will help you make a random draw. And a random draw will be representative or very close to representative. And it will also give you instruction. It will explain the whole process, and it will discuss about drawing the random sample, creating a unique number for each address in the sampling frame. So once you've attached a unique number, so you have put it in an Excel list and created one row for each address, then you want to create a random number. There's several ways to do that, and copy it into an empty cell in that list. And then you can sort the address list by those random numbers. And so now you have a random sample. And once you've done that step, then you're going to use a sample size calculator to determine the minimum number of responses for the survey. And you can base this on the sampling frame, the total number of residential addresses in the area, or if you think the ACS data count is more reliable, the population count, you can use that. And then once you've assigned those random numbers and sorted the list, then you're going to make your selection. So we recommend that you oversample by at least 100% to ensure that you get a sufficient number of completed surveys. There's always going to be a couple of surveys where there's some unreliable information or it's incomplete. And so you can't just sample the exact number and do that number of interviews. So if you say it said you must sample at least 60 addresses, you want to actually draw a sample of 120 or even 200. And that way, even if you don't manage to collect 200 surveys, you will still have enough extra information in case there's any issues. And more data is good. So it's a good idea to oversample and plan to collect a few more responses than exactly that required number. So next we'll talk a bit about administering the survey. As we mentioned, there's different ways you can go about doing this. So using the address list from the sampling frame, you can create a mailing list. So if you decide to do this mail out to web, so you're going to send a letter and it's going to have that link and a unique ID for the family. And that's going to go out in the mail. Then they can click on the link. They can take the survey. You can also include a QR code, and you should also include a telephone number, not necessarily for people to take the survey over the phone, but in case they have any questions or they want to verify the legitimacy of the survey. One thing we found in our tests was that in rural communities, a lot of people use PO boxes. And so that makes it a little bit harder to verify that you're getting the right resident and that they actually live at that address. But you can ask them to confirm their address and if it's in the service area. And then after you do this mailing, you may not achieve the sampling rate that you desire. So the next step would probably be to go for an in-person door-to-door survey. And this slide just shows you the page on the website for the Income Survey Toolkit that give you examples of different types of outreach materials that you can modify for your community. So we have a flyer, we have a letter, and a reminder postcard. And then the last three items are things that your field team would carry with them to provide information to people on the doorstep. So next, let's talk about in-person interviewing, or sometimes called field work. So the field work team needs a packet of materials. They need a protocol for approaching people and gaining cooperation. And you will also need to train the interviewers and maybe hire them if your staff isn't going to take on this work. The materials that you'll use in the field depend on your approach to the survey. So handheld tablets can be used, but make sure to bring backup chargers and make sure they are set to a bright mode if you're working during the day. Always bring paper surveys as backup. You might have technical issues with the tablet, and a paper copy of the survey means you can always collect information. A name tag is a great way to assure respondents that you are there legitimately. So if you can use a town logo or a seal, that's ideal. And also bring materials about the survey. I just showed you that a slide or two ago. A letter of support from the mayor or another city official, the flyer, and a generic version of the mail request that you sent out to the households if that was your approach. And all of these can help legitimize your efforts and inform people. Be prepared to leave a flyer with them if they want to read that. They need to know why you're there. And so it's important to give some supporting information. So hiring and training interviewers. So you can either use local staff or hire people to do the door-to-door survey. Staff don't need previous experience doing a survey, but everyone who works on the survey, with or without previous experience, should have training on the purpose of this specific survey and the procedures that you are using. Hiring students is also a good option if you have a community college or a university nearby. They might even work for class credit. But you could probably do one of these surveys in a small area over a weekend if you had 2 or 3 teams of 2 people each. So that's 4 to 6 staff working on this over a 2 or 3 day period. You might need to do some follow-up work during the week. In our pilot, we found working over the weekend really worked well because a lot more folks were at home. You also may want to think about the timing. So if there's some kind of big community event where everybody's going to be, you'll want to wait for another day to do the survey. So next, you're going to need to develop a strategy for the door-to-door interviews. First, make sure you're at the correct address. So the address must be one that you sampled. And then when you contact a resident, you're going to want to make sure they're eligible for the survey, and then you'll administer the survey. The key eligibility requirement at this point is that they be 18 or older. The other eligibility issues are covered in the survey itself, but you can preload some of those questions. If somebody were to tell you, oh, they're just visiting, then you want to ask them to talk to somebody who lives in that household most of the time. So in-person interviewers must stick to the addresses on their list. If you're unfamiliar with the area, use a community map or online map to navigate to the correct addresses. And then make sure if another field team has already visited this address. Make sure to sample the correct number of multifamily units. So you may not have individual unit numbers, but in this development, we need to capture 5 of the units. And you can randomly select them when you arrive there. And then make a note if an address appears vacant. You will have a case management log to record this information. And just some general tips. This is true for any survey effort. To just make sure that you're always being polite and respectful, and that in your training, you practice different scenarios where maybe a resident is skeptical, why are you here, or hesitant to participate. They might think you're selling them something. So you just want to be clear and polite that this is a survey to benefit the community. It's being conducted by the local government or whatever appropriate entity, and you're not selling them anything. You just want to get their information. And if you can't answer a question, it's fine to say you don't know and that you will follow up with them later. So here's a little bit more about determining eligibility and gaining cooperation. So if nobody is home, the first step is to leave a sorry we missed you card, and that is available in the Income Survey Toolkit, and you can customize it for your area. You want to leave it near the mailbox or near the front door. It is not allowed to leave it inside the mailbox, but put it someplace where you think they can see it. Then if somebody does answer the door, you're going to identify yourself by name, explain that you're working on a study for the community, and make sure that person you're talking to is eligible. So initially, if they're 18 years old or older. And the survey templates will then have an introduction and then ask about if they're a permanent resident. So that's part of the survey flow. But if there's no permanent residents at home or no people who live there most of the time who are at home, you will want to see if you can come back another time when somebody will be home. And then you can again leave them that sorry, we missed you card. And that card will have a link for the survey, and you can write on the card their unique ID so they can take the survey with that code. So if somebody is home and they're willing, then you go ahead and conduct the survey. If nobody's available, then you can, but you are talking to somebody, you can schedule a time to visit later or leave that sorry, we missed you card. Then as soon as you walk away and get back to your car, wherever you're heading, then record that outcome information immediately in your case management log. So you're going to have a paper copy of that, although you can also do one online. You can write down what happened during that visit. Either you completed a survey, or you scheduled a time to come back later, or you left a card, or they refused to take the survey and told you don't come back. So these are the steps when you're getting to the doorstep. So the first thing you're going to want to decide to do is enter that unique ID. For some of these survey applications, it's going to pull up some information for you. So if you're using a tablet, what we found was that it was easier to enter that code before you knocked on the door. And then if nobody was home or nobody was eligible to take the survey, then you just delete that. You don't make an entry for it right then. If you're doing a survey using a paper instrument, then you can always write the code on after you've completed the interview. The first thing after you've found somebody who's eligible, you do want to make sure that this is the correct address and that they are living there most of the time. That is in the survey instruments. Next, you're going to go through each of the questions as written. And the key information when you're doing an income survey is the family size, number of families, and the income for each family. And if they give you monthly income, you can write that down, or you can do some quick multiplication. Most of these are programmed to use annual income in the processing tools. Once you've completed the survey, thank them for participating, and then you will move on. And this is where you will do your case management. So each case is basically one of the addresses that are on the sampling list. And it's really, really important to track all the in-person visits in a case management log. So this is going to help you coordinate if you have multiple teams in the field. And using a shared spreadsheet is a really good approach for this and allow for easy communication across the team. So you may want to print out a paper version of this to carry with you and fill the spreadsheet in at the end of the day. And we do have tools for that as well. So we do have a process document that just includes some summary information for the field teams. You can customize that for your local area. A simplified version of the log that you can print out, and then a Excel version of the shared log, which contains a bit more information. And you can use that in Google Drive or whatever sharing program you have is a really good approach to that. One more knowledge check. This is the last one. Do not worry. You don't need to do any division here. So the first part is to determine the percentage of persons that are LMI, low and moderate income, using a calculator. So the number of persons, so we've completed our survey, and we know that the number of persons in LMI families is 67, and the total number of persons in all families is 132. So what percentage is that? So the answer to that is 50.7% of the folks are LMI. So your question is this service area eligible? Right. Okay, so the answer is no. Why is it no? Because 50.7% is less than 51%, and rounding up is not allowed. So Yes, most of us would round this up to 51%, but the HUD rules do not allow that. So it has to be 51% or higher. Okay, next we'll talk about analyzing the survey data. And we're going to prepare the data, probably using Excel, and there will be a user guide if you used one of the survey applications that we provided a template for. You're going to clean that data by checking for outliers or inconsistent information. So the outliers are values that are much higher or much lower than the average value. So example, a family size of 20. That is pretty high. You're not going to see too many of those. It might be correct. So you want to try to verify that if possible. You can ask families to share a phone number. We did that in the survey templates that you would call only to verify data. And the other way to do that is to ask the person who actually conducted that survey if you were doing a door-to-door survey. If you're doing it online and there's no way to verify that information, it is okay to remove that if you can't verify it. And the other example is if you have family income in the tens of millions, somebody probably just made a data entry error, but you can't change that because you don't know what the real value was meant to be. So that should also be removed. Another good reason to try to achieve more responses than the minimum required number. So after you clean the data, it is time to process it. And this is the calculation. We showed this to you before. And I'll just go ahead and skip that. And then at the end of your survey work, you're going to want to prepare a data memo. And this can be done using one of the Excel tools that's provided in the Income Survey Toolkit. You can copy the data into the spreadsheet and it will process this using an embedded formula. And I'm going to show you how this works right now. Yes, okay, great. All right, so here I have downloaded this spreadsheet from the HUD Exchange website and from the Income Survey website. Income Survey Toolkit. And each of these, this spreadsheet is for the Microsoft Forms Fulcrum tool. We did the pilot, we use these in combination. But you could use it if you collect data in one or the other. And you can also use it for manual input as well. And each spreadsheet, each Excel tool has the first tab has all the instructions. And an important point is that this is not for data cleaning. So if you are looking for the outliers, you should do that before you copy it into this tool. And you can have it as a CSV file. You can export most of these as CSV files or as an Excel file. Either way should work. Before you do that, before you paste any data into here, you want to click on the LMI data tab. And here you're going to want to, these green places mean you can add information. So this sign will take you to the HUD Exchange and give you that, take you to a site where you can download the information. Here it is. So this page has the most current CDBG income limits, and you can go ahead and click on here and get to the information you need. And if you want to calculate your sample size that is required, you can click here and it will take you to the SurveyMonkey sample size calculator. So in this case, we're going to add data for Microsoft Forms. So I click on this tab. I need to put it into this first cell, A1. And here's my data sheet. I'm going to select this entire data sheet. I'm going to copy it. I'm going to go over here. I'm going to paste it. And now I have my data. Next, I need to fill out this reference sheet. So I have this pre-filled. And this is my community. It's a town. This is the dates I did the survey. This is going to be your project manager. And then in this case, I said, oh, there are 500 people in this area. And the required margin of error is 10%, and the confidence level is 90%. So normally I would have already calculated this, but I'll show you how it works. And here you would just put in 500. And then for confidence level, you would click 90, and the margin of error the highest margin of error you should do is around 10, and then you say your sample size that's required is 61. So I'm going to put in here 61. And then I think in this case, the number of households we sampled was something like 75. And we say households here because these are the addresses, so they could have contained multiple families. So now I'll go to the report tab, and this will generate a report for me using some of the information and based on the data that I shared. So here's what I just entered, and here's our minimum sample size, and the valid number of surveys in here is 74. So maybe one of them just didn't have the income information, but everything else was in there correctly. And we have a total number of persons in the families was 139, and average family size 1.88. So in this case, if we'd seen a family of 20, say, whoa, that is really high for this community, we should verify that information. And this is where we do that calculation. So here's our total number of persons and families, 139. The total number of LMI persons is 72. If you do that calculation, you're going to get 51.8% low and moderate income persons. And then this will be qualify for the area benefit. And you can print this out to sign it. You would just click on the little printer icon. And you'll get a PDF that you can download and sign with that information. The last, I'm just going to skip that for now. The last screen is just showing you the part of the Income Survey Toolkit that includes the links to all of the Excel tools. And you can use any of those Excel tools to either process data from one of the applications, and then they all have a manual data entry option. I didn't show that to you, but they all have that. So you can use any of them for manual data entry. So Robert, I don't know if you wanted to talk through any of these Q&As. I'll just sort of review them quickly.
Yeah, we got quite a few actually.
Yeah, this is great. Okay, so I see you answered some of them.
Your questions in.
Yeah, the webinar will be available in a couple of days. We just have to, we'll be adding captions to it, so that will take a couple of days.
One that you could probably answer live. If a telephone income survey is conducted, how does one certify their data? Are they asked to like verbally agree to the information they provide?
Yes, you would want to verify their address and make sure that is a legitimate address in your service area. And if their answers are kind of within the normal range, then that would be acceptable.
Yeah, there's no like the respondent is not like certifying the validity of their answers other than just answering the survey.
Yeah, I don't think so. No,
right.
that wouldn't be standard practice. Let's see, a question about race ethnicity. This is kind of a long one. Okay.
Yeah. So as pointed out, something with our survey that when you're surveying a family, that's more than one person, the race and ethnicity categories, it allows you to select more than one, but it isn't really allowing you to indicate the number of people that are falling into each of the categories.
Right, because it is really just for the person who's responding to the survey. You would have to have a different structure if you wanted to get the race ethnicity for each individual in the family. Yeah. And that is not the purpose for this type of survey. You could modify the question, but it is definitely a more complicated question structure. It would require like adding a family roster. So that's like a lot more entries. So this was really meant to be very simple, primarily to capture the family income. If you wanted to change the categories, that would be pretty easy to edit though, if you don't like those categories, or if you wanted to have a multiracial as one category and then they select one of the races, and then they could select multiracial. That would be an easy modification to make. It
So
doesn't
then
exactly.
the second part of this then is kind of a question to me, is really like, okay, so you've done the survey, you use the template, you've got the race and ethnicity for only one of the family members. Now, how do you report your accomplishments in IDIS, which have it broken out by race and ethnicity? So to Jennifer's point, the survey design here is to qualify your project like upfront. So we want to make sure that it's going to benefit an area that's at least 51% low and moderate income, or your exception percentage, of course. And then once you're there, the activities qualify. Now, down the road, that's when accomplishment reporting happens. And accomplishment reporting is required, but there's not like a limit that you have to hit of a certain category of people. It's just an accomplishment number that's being reported. So for that, you can use the data from the survey and try to compile it. You can also still just refer back to the percentages of people that are in each race and ethnic category according to the census. Mm-hmm. So you can use those numbers to help fill out your accomplishment reporting. But the compliance purpose of this survey, again, is really just those two questions: family size and family income.
Right. Right. So you can get a little bit of other information, but you would want to consider that really for the respondent individually, not for the whole household. We do have a question, or we had at one point a question like, does anybody over a certain age live in this household? If you wanted to get a sense of that, but it wouldn't tell you how many people over that age live there. That would have to be a different question structure. Okay, so I see the next one says, is it all LMI families sampled or all in the service area? So it's a sample, and the sample represents everybody in the service area. So you would use the number from the sample that you drew for the survey. How many surveys completed above the minimum sample size is acceptable? Is it okay to stop when you get the number? Well, as long as you've done a random draw, adding more surveys should just increase the precision of your estimate. That is, your estimate will become more and more reliable as you add additional data. So if you've hit that minimum number, it's pretty unlikely that additional surveys are going to flip you over to 51% if you're running at about, say, 40% LMI. Now, if you're like the example in the slide deck and you're at 50.8, yeah, it could go either way, right? You're really on the edge there. So it may be beneficial to collect a few more surveys, but you're just going to run out of time at some point to continue collecting data. So that's a judgment call you'll have to make for your area.
I imagine if you did the mailing method, at some point you got to decide when to stop and when to, you can't wait for those last surveys to come in forever. Right. That's why you do oversampling. It's because you're not going to get everything back. So at some point you need to say, okay, this is where we're going to end it. Now, stopping like watching your if you're calculating as samples are coming in, don't do that. Don't.
It's not survey best practices, but you should keep sort of a run. You do have to count to make sure you've hit your number. And right. Then once you've hit it, you want to keep going a little bit longer. So if you're having a really hard time achieving that minimum sample, then you want to know that, right? So you do want to track it, but you don't want to track the LMI percentage as you're going, because that might bias you as the researcher, What
we definitely do not want you to do is to hit 51%, stop collecting samples, even though they're still coming in.
Yeah.
Don't do that.
I agree.
I will say on sample sizes too, some of you may have noticed we used to have a recommendation for a margin of error of plus or minus 10, but it had a stricter confidence. It resulted in really large samples.
Yeah.
what
if
we've
we
done is
drop the
change
confidence
that.
level down to 5, it's going to really increase the required number of.
Yeah. We saw some real substantial decreases in the required sample size for your surveys. So the whole idea here is to make these things easier. We're giving you tools. We decrease the sample size that we're recommending. Trying to make these things easier for you.
Yeah. All right. So there was a question about the 2% margin of error. So that was just an example. But if the ACS data for your area has a 2% margin of error, it's pretty unlikely that you're going to get a lower margin of error if you were to conduct a survey. So I would make the decision not to do that. In that case, I would accept the ACS data. But we know that a lot of the margins of error in small areas are quite a bit higher than 10% in the ACS. So if it's higher than 10%, that's when I would start considering it might make sense to do an income survey. Okay, safety and door-to-door work, and how do you randomly pick addresses in the location? So safety, yes, we were always concerned about safety. So when we did our pilot test, it was like posted no trespassing, we just did not go there. If there's a good place to leave a sorry we missed you card, then we could do that. But if there's like dogs or any concerns about safety, you just need to skip that address. And in your case management log, there will be a code, what we call disposition code, where we'd say like posted no trespass, and we didn't visit. So that's like a judgment call. But I think as part of the training, if you know the area well, you want to tell people like, okay, this don't go to this house, or if you see this situation, just skip that one. And then how do you randomly pick the addresses? Well, that's in the random sampling process. And so I would refer you to the guidebook for a few more details about that. But basically, you're going to assign a random number to each address, and then you're going to sort them by the random number. And that will mean now they're in a random order, and then you can just go down and pick the first 60, 100, or how many addresses you're going to include in your sample. Recommendations on how to overcome people's reluctance to share their income. So this is interesting. We did not find, I think the majority of people in both the online surveys and door-to-door just would tell us their income. They would sometimes work it out with us. So like, well, I make about this much a month. And then, I could just multiply it by 12 and enter that. But if they don't want to, then we have another option. So in all of the templates and for the in-person, there's always an option to say, I don't want to give you my income. And then they will see a range to choose from. And in some of them, it's based, the template will calculate what the income limit is for a family of this family size they've already entered into the survey. And then it will just say, is your income above or below this amount? That's in some of the templates. And then for in-person, we have something you can download that's called an income card. And you would fill that out with the local income limits. And then if somebody didn't want to give you their income, you could show them this card and they could just point to it. And then you would enter that category on the paper survey. And that is the normal approach to getting people to share income information. One reason we programmed it to ask for their actual income is because many states have other programs with different income limits, and that will allow the survey to have a multi-use purpose for other income-based programs, but that we always have that other option.
We also were a little concerned about, and there's a question that we answered already on this topic. Really great question. Angela, you've got a couple great questions. Thank you. It was really about like when you're asking for folks' income, it's kind of implied that there's a reason you're asking. And if you're out there and you're talking about the possibility of a community development project coming to their neighborhood and that the neighborhood needs to be low income, you're sort of inserting a bias that they might check, oh, I'm below that line, right? So we try to minimize that in the way that we design the tools, and we encourage you guys as well to really just try and get an honest an honest response from folks about their income, and don't lead them to think that if they check that they are below that level or they enter a lower income, that that a new park will come to their area, or otherwise, inappropriately influence their response. So,
Yeah, it can happen. So the intro language should be neutral. And if you don't like the intro language in the templates, you can change it to be more neutral. But we do want to be clear that we're not selling anything. This isn't market research. That's not the purpose of it. So hopefully that will encourage people to answer. And I did have some cases where somebody was really reluctant. They were suspicious of me. And so when I explained, like, oh, in the past, the funds were used for this purpose and that purpose, and then they were willing.
Yeah.
So
I've worked with you now for over a year on this project, and I'm still suspicious of you. So.
Over a year, Robert? Not like 5 years. Okay, so there was a question about random sampling, and if a census survey that is like 100% sample is allowed. Yes, I would assume so. There's if you have the time and funds to undertake that, there's no reason why you couldn't do a census. And a census in the census just means 100% of the people who live in your service area. You would try to gather information from all of them. Of course, this is a much more challenging undertaking. And in terms of calculating your sample size, no, you don't need to calculate it because you're going to do 100%. Now, the odds that you'll actually achieve 100% are not great. Even the U.S. Census does not actually manage to survey 100% of people. So you can post data collection, apply a similar calculation to see what you achieved. And in that case, I would use the ACS estimate, population estimate for the service area or close to it as your baseline, and then see how many responses you achieved. And then you'll get a feel for what your margin of error was. But remember that even the ACS population estimates can have a very big margin of error around them, because they will only dip in and sample. It's like a handful of people in the rural areas, at least. So even doing 60 people is probably more than the number of people the ACS is sweeping up every 3 or 4 years when they do their surveys. So I think that is one of the reasons that HUD decided to make it a little easier to do a smaller sample and make that acceptable. But if you want to do a larger sample, it will be more accurate and it would serve you as a good baseline in the future. So I love data. I would not discourage you from doing that, but it's just it really is a cost consideration. And it might take you a lot longer too.
I've only seen situations where folks have wanted to sample everyone in the service area when the service area is only like 3 or 4 houses. Maybe they're extending a water line.
Right. If it's that small, then you're going to essentially have to do a census.
There's a great question in here from Adam. Thank you. What's the benefit of breaking down the population of families instead of just looking at households? So it's in the Housing and Community Development Act that way. I wish it was households. That's what Census publishes, and that would be really easy for us to. If we used households, we could have data out a whole lot faster than what we do, because we have to get special tabulations of data from the Census Bureau. It has to be on the family level because that's what our act says we have to use. So that's the only reason.
Yeah. I see a question about the need for consent. So yes, that is just the introduction to the survey and them agreeing to talk to you. That is sufficient consent for this type of survey. But it is formally, we would call it informed consent, especially if it was a HUD survey and we had to go through OMB. But in this case, just informing them about what it's about, what the information will be used for in the broadest terms possible, and that their information will be kept confidential. That's really all you need to say. And then if you mailed it out, you just write that on the survey form. If you're asking them to do a mail back survey, if you're sending them that letter with a link, again, that letter would contain that information. And then if they take the survey, that's essentially their consent. But that is yes, it's an important part of any survey to make sure people know why they're telling you what you're asking them about. Okay, distrust about the data. I think that, I didn't find too much of a problem with that if you made it clear that it was for a community benefit. Although you could run into that issue of people like artificially lowering their income, but people don't tend to do that. So I think just having that in consent statement, informed consent, just saying this is what the purpose is, and your data won't be used for anything else. And now, if it is going to be used for, let's say, state programs, then you want to include that in the initial introduction as well. The ID thing, we wouldn't collect their names regardless. The purpose of the unique ID, well, it had two purposes. So we were able to program some of the applications that when we entered the ID, it populated with the address information. So when we were going door to door, that really saved us a lot of time because we didn't have to like type it in or write it down. Well, we did have to write it down if we did a paper survey. But if we're using a tablet and you enter that ID, and there's the information. Now, sometimes the ID didn't work, so we had like a code to work around that. And then for people taking the survey online, what it does is one person couldn't just fill out multiple surveys. Every time you enter a survey, you have to use that ID. So if they did enter it multiple times and we saw multiple entries for the same ID, then we would know there was a problem. Somebody was trying to game the system, but why would they do that? I don't know. It's not a big risk in this type of survey, but I think the ID, it's not so much to protect their anonymity because we were never going to include names in the survey, but we do still have their address information. So that's easy to link. So there's still some confidentiality concerns that, as the people collecting the data will then need to remove the addresses, like after you've finished your data collection. The best practice is to take the addresses off, keep the unique IDs, so there's no risk of sharing the address information, but we never put names on anything. I think maybe one mailing we did that, but then later we just changed it to say dear resident, because we don't really care if it's the person whose name is on the utility roll living there. We care about the current resident. Whoever's living there now is who should be filling out the survey. And you answered that about. Oh boy.
There was a question about when the service area extends outside of the town into unincorporated areas. I'm just imagining like a rural town and the water system maybe goes out a little bit further. In those cases, yeah, you can survey. Really what you want to survey is the folks that are benefiting. Sometimes that doesn't match up well with any jurisdiction. It doesn't match up with a census tract. It doesn't match up with your town's jurisdiction. It is its own thing. So we try to just, match that service area as close as possible to some existing geography. If you're going to use HUD's data, if you're going out and doing your own survey, it's even easier to do like a custom geography. And you can break it into pieces too. You can do simultaneous surveys of different neighborhoods and compile your results. And there's a way to calculate. It's like a weighted average. There's a way to calculate that together so that you're determining the percentage of all the people together and the percentage for each neighborhood. And the way the sample size works out as you get to smaller areas, there's another question about this as well. The sample size reduces the smaller the community gets, but it's not like it's not going to reduce like a ton. And as the community the service area gets even bigger, the sample size will increase, but it's not going to increase a ton.
Not a ton.
It's always going to be a manageable, typically a manageable number, depending on really how big you want to go.
This question is interesting though from Angela again about whether, so if you're only doing a small area, does it still have to beat the HUD LMISD? And I don't know for the entire community. So if you only have that number for the entire community, would they need to get under that for like a sub area?
Yeah, we recognize that when you're looking up your MOE, your margin of error, you're about to do a survey, you need to know what the margin of error is that you need to hit. It's probably going to be 10, but it could be less. The geography that you look at may not exactly match your service area. So in our notice, is it CPD notice 19-02, it goes into this detail a little bit about just picking the best matching area. I think it says the most overlapping area.
And then there is a question about the lifespan of the data. I think it's good for 3 years. Is that correct?
Well, it could be longer. So we don't really specify a lifespan for the data. I will say, if you look at what we've done in the past, HUD, we used to base these LMI data on the decennial census. So our data was only being updated every 10 years. And now we've switched to updating on 5-year ACS estimates.
Okay.
So currently, the data set we're referencing now for the HUD provided data is the 2011 to 2015 ACS 5-year estimate. As I mentioned, we have to get special tabulations from the Census Bureau. They've given us those now. So we are preparing the data for the 16 to 20 ACS LMI update. So that should be coming relatively soon. So you can look forward to that. But to the question about the dates, we don't specify a date. In some cases, 10 years would be fine. In other cases, 2 years might be too much, because you know that there wasn't a large apartment building put right in the middle of your small service area, or some other extenuating circumstance that makes you really question those data. A reason you might want to go ahead and just kind of expire that data set and do a new one. But it depends.
Yeah.
We don't prescribe a time period.
So there is a question about what percentage of people decline to participate. Now, we can't exactly answer that, but when we did a mail out asking people to take the survey online, I think we got maybe 10 or 20% of people responding to that. When you go door to door and there's somebody home, it's going to be much higher. So if you're face to face with somebody, they're much more likely to actually take the survey. We definitely got people declining, but the percentage was lower than the implied decline of just not clicking on the link or having to type the link in. So you will probably get better response rates if you go in person. But that doesn't mean not to try the mail out, because even 20% saved us 10 or 15 doors that we had to knock on, and that's not nothing. So, as we discussed before, we do make it possible for them to answer in a income range or threshold, so they don't have to give their exact income if they're not comfortable with that. It's just, you would be surprised, like if you're face to face with somebody, it's just much harder to say no. And then you also would have an opportunity to use some very gentle persuasion to get them to participate. But if there's a hard no, then you just move on and go on. But a lot of times what you'll find is people think that it's some kind of marketing thing, or you're trying to sell them something. And if they get the message that it's not that, then your odds of getting them to participate go way, way up.
There was an earlier question I wanted to raise to the group too. It's a good question about, using HUD's data, not the survey specifically, but using HUD's data and essentially qualifying whole counties. So there's a lot of people have also over the years reached out to me and asked about like making maps of qualified areas. Like they're imagining a map with areas that are red, areas that are green. You can do an activity here, you can not do an activity there. I always discourage people from developing maps like that because service areas can really change, and service areas might be county-wide. In that case, sure, you want to know if the whole county qualifies. But in a lot of cases, service areas are going to be smaller than the county, maybe even smaller than a city in that county. And they could very well have a high concentration of low and moderate income people in that service area. But the whole county, those data will be kind of washed out. And it maybe won't show that LMI percentage as qualifying for an activity, when in fact, that little service area for that activity would qualify. So that's why we never publish any maps that are like color coded in that way, because we really encourage you to take our puzzle pieces of data that we provide to build your service area geographies and to calculate your LMI percentage and qualify activities that way, and not to create some standard areas that qualify and don't qualify.
Are there any other of these we want to address? Do they have to submit survey results to their HUD rep for approval? I think yes.
Well, you have to keep documentation of your survey for monitoring. There is a, let me really quickly find the language.
I mean, there was another question about question about sample size requirement that is outlined in the guidebook. But basically, you're going to have to sample with a 10% margin of error. That's the highest you can use, and a 10% confidence level. That's your minimum sample size requirement. And that's going to be usually under 100 responses.
We reserve the right to see everything that you collected, and
so you should retain. I would retain your survey results at least for a year. But that is really something that, I think HUD would, if HUD can audit you at any point, then you want to keep it for whatever that retention rule is. And I don't know what it is, but if you can keep it confidential in a safe place, in a safe server, I would hang on to it until the results have been approved.
Now, the things that we have approved in the past have been survey methodologies, where we've looked at a proposed methodology for a survey and approved that as an appropriate method.
Would HUD ever audit or anybody in the chain audit the actual surveys to verify results?
During a monitoring, in fact, we may review documentation on surveys to ensure. Like if we saw a survey of 100 people and 51 were LMI, and there was no like calculation sheets, there was no samples of surveys that were dispersed and collected, there was no random method for sampling provided, we would probably have some questions about whether or not a survey was done and whether it was done appropriately.
So I would hang on to that stuff for whatever like the normal audit period is. Angela has another good question about the income limit. So she notes that since HUD only publishes income limits up through family size of 8, but we do include in all the templates a calculation for family sizes larger than 8 that will automatically play in the background of the automated ones. For the paper one, you'll have to, you may want to add a few more categories just to be safe. And she wants to confirm that this is approved.
Yep.
Is that, yeah.
Yep.
We used it from the HUD website and added that into the templates. I don't think we ever encountered a family larger than 8, but certainly family sizes larger than 8 exist. Now 20 probably exists somewhere in the country. That's pretty rare, but like 10, 9, 10, 11, 12, I think like every additional family member, the odds of actually encountering that, it's going down. But but we built it in there. So in case that is a verifiable number, then you can put it in there. I don't know, are there any other questions you think we should address? Claire and Robert wrote answers to several of these, and I don't know if it's possible for, this is kind of up to Zoom if we can save all of these, but I will try to save them so we can maybe write this up. And oh, there is a question about documenting mixed methods surveys. Yeah, so that use the case management tool. That's what it's set up for. And every mode you're going to use, what I ended up doing was there's a field in there for completion, and then you can say online, telephone, in person, and that way you can track what method is kind of the most successful in your survey. And then you would know if you do this again, oh yeah, we're definitely going to send that letter out because 10% of the responses came from the online method. And we already own that survey software. So we're just going to go ahead and use it. Oh yeah, so there's a question about, I think you answered about the homelessness. That's a good question. We don't have a methodology for counting street homeless people.
Yeah, keep in mind that we're talking about a subset of ways to qualify a CDBG activity.
So that,
yeah, we're only talking about area benefit, and we're only talking about surveys under area benefit. We didn't talk about benefiting low and moderate income basis, low and moderate income persons on the basis of housing,
right?
On the basis of clientele or services, urgent need, slum blight, low and moderate income jobs. There's a lot of ways to qualify an activity, and sometimes what you're thinking of as an area benefit activity might be able to be qualified a different way. So not only do you, when you look at those survey data and you see that your community is below 51%, that's, you may have to do a survey to do an area benefit activity, but you wouldn't have to do a survey to do an activity that creates jobs, provides housing. Those are, you're really just checking the income of the beneficiaries that you're serving in each of those cases. And in some cases, you don't even have to check, you just presume, such as homeless persons.
Right. We did, there are things like multifamily dwellings or even people living in assisted living, you can count those folks, and they would just be sampled in the same way. So we have a lot of details about the sampling. And if you have a multi-unit building, sometimes it'll show up as one address, but what we recommend is if you know how many units are in that building, to add a row for each one of those units. And so that will be included in the total count of the units. And it's less important specifically which unit you choose than that you get the right number of units from that building into the sample survey. Well, I think we may have used up all our time. And I can share the screen now with the thank you for joining slide. Here it is. I did figure out how to do that. So Claire, who's been answering some of the questions in the chat, if you want to reach out to her with any follow-up questions, she'll be happy to respond. And as we mentioned, there will be the slide deck as a PDF will be available, and the recorded webinar will also be available as quickly as we can get it processed and ready. I think probably sometime next week.
Thank you, Jennifer. And thank you everyone for attending.
Yeah, thanks so much for joining. It's been, I really appreciate all the questions and your participation.
Okay. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.